Hurricane Ian delayed this week's public hearing of the January 6th committee, but its important work continues. Today, Virginia Ginny Thomas, longtime right-wing activist and wife of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, was interviewed in person by the committee for 3.5 hours. I mean, it's about daggone time since Mrs. Thomas has a lot to explain. Committee Chair Benny Thompson said that she answered some questions and expressed that she still believes the 2020 election was stolen from Donald Trump, which is exactly what she argued in numerous texts to then Chief of Staff Mark Meadows in the days and weeks following the election, which is around the same time Mrs. Thomas was also pressuring state lawmakers in Arizona and Wisconsin to choose their own fake electors. And of particular interest to the committee, Mrs. Thomas's emails with Trump lawyer John Eastman, who came up with the plot to keep Trump in power in his infamous coup memo, urging Vice President Mike Pence to simply overturn the election all by himself. It is also worth noting that John Eastman once clerked for Clarence Thomas. Regarding her interview today, Ginny Thomas's attorney released a statement saying, quote, she answered a lot of the committee's questions as she told the committee her minimal and mainstream activity focused on ensuring that reports of fraud and irregularities were investigated. Beyond that, she played no role in any events in the 2020 election results, unquote. Weird use of the word mainstream. Joining me now is Nick Ackerman, former assistant special Watergate prosecutor and a former assistant U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York. Thank you for being here, Nick. You know, this is so unusual. It's sui generis. I can't even name the wife of or spouse of any other Supreme Court justice ever in history. This woman has been a longtime right-wing activist, and she seemed to have been actively involved, including emailing her husband's former clerk, John Eastman. What do you make of all of it, and what do you think the probative value of talking to her might have been?
Well, it's hard to say what the probative value is going to be. I mean, my big question is, who asked her to call these legislators in Wisconsin and Arizona to get them to basically vote in these fake Trump electors? That's my big question. I mean, that's the part that is really concerning. I mean, she could not have done that on her own. It's hard to believe that she was acting as a free agent there. And the other big concern, obviously, is that she's a wife of a Supreme Court justice. And Clarence Thomas, while she was doing all this, he was the one dissenting vote when the January 6th committee was trying to get all of Trump's records from the White House that were at the archives. And he was the only one that dissented. And then when Pennsylvania the Republicans tried to appeal the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania, which gave an extra 3 days to count votes, not a big deal, considering the circumstances. He went on and wrote this dissent that basically banned, absentee ballots, and basically came up with this idea that there's more chances for fraud with absentee ballots than regular voting, all of which is absolutely crazy, but it's the same thing that she's been espousing. So you've got a real conflict of interest here. It's just very unusual. I can't remember any situation in the court where a spouse has taken a political view that's basically right on the money with her husband, and they both claim they never talk about this stuff, which I find completely absurd.
And I'll note that Chairman Thompson did say that she was a witness. They weren't accusing her of anything. They would include something if there's something of merit, they'll include it in the next hearing. That's the notes from Chairman Benny Thomas. But you just named the less cuckoo things that she was doing. Here are some of the things that she was texting to the Chief of Staff to the President, Mark Meadows. This is 2 days after the election. Quote, Biden crime family and ballot fraud co-conspirators are being arrested and detained for ballot fraud right now in over coming days and will be living in barges off Gitmo to face military tribunals for sedition. This person is a conspiracy theorist. She doesn't seem to be wrapped too tight when it comes to her versions of reality. Is it possible that somebody like a John Eastman would collaborate with a Supreme Court justice's wife? To what end? Do you think that this could have been because they thought that eventually the election might end up in the Supreme Court? End up in front of the Supreme Court?
Well, I think they were certainly trying to do that. They were trying to get it into the courts, even though every single court, including the Supreme Court, knocked them down. But yeah, I mean, look, she probably had a fairly close relationship with Eastman beforehand. I mean, the judges always have yearly events with their clerks. The clerks
Yeah.
that are clerked for somebody in the past, they always keep in touch with their judge. And I'm sure she met him in the course of that. I mean, the birds of a feather flock together. I mean, they're both crazy in that sense. So it doesn't surprise me that they would be feeding off each other. And it doesn't surprise me that they would be talking. I mean, the real question is, how much influence does she have on what Clarence Thomas is writing on the Supreme Court? And what was she doing talking to legislators in this criminal conspiracy to try and get fake electors for Trump elected in Wisconsin and Arizona? That is the key question.
The other issue with Clarence Thomas, I mean, the issue is you can assume that somebody's spouse has their own life and does their own thing. Fine. But like you said, there's symmetry between what he's voting on and what she's doing. And then also there is this. Back in 2011, this is a story that has resurfaced. Between 2003 and 2007, Virginia Thomas, a longtime conservative activist, earned nearly $700,000 from the Heritage Foundation, which you've heard that name a lot, according to Common Cause's review of their foundation, the foundation's IRS records. Clarence Thomas failed to note the income in his Supreme Court financial disclosures. So he's kind of hiding her income, not being honest about it. But there's nothing anyone can do because there are no ethics rules in the Supreme Court.
No, it just shows you what's going on. They're all trying to get close to Clarence Thomas and influence Clarence Thomas through Ginny. That's what's going on. That's why they're paying her. That's why Mark Meadows was taking your calls. If you look at those 29 emails that go back and forth, I mean, it's pretty obvious to me, if her name was just Ginny Jones, she would not have gotten past the operator at the White House, right? I mean, they're all trying to influence Clarence Thomas through her. And that is what's really going on. And that's why this is so evil.
Well, if we don't have much time, but do you have any comment on this special master, the Eileen Cannon, this judge, who has essentially delayed, allowed a delay in Trump having to file an affidavit saying whether or not he believed anything was planted in his house? She's given him another bly.
Yeah, I think that the government agreed to part of that. Just because they've had a hard time getting a vendor that was going to put all these documents online. And the reason was because none of these vendors would want to engage in business with Donald Trump. They didn't want to sign a contract with him. And I'm sure it's because they knew they wouldn't be paid, even though under her order, he could be held in contempt if he doesn't pay, which means he could go to jail. So it's crazy. None of this is very good for Donald Trump. None of it. It's just going to keep this whole matter in the spotlight. Yeah. It's just going to remind people right up through the midterms what a crook this guy is.
Very succinctly said. Nick Ackerman, thank you very much, my friend. Appreciate you. Okay, come